Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Paul. Paul, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me. And please, for everyone out there listening, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Paul Denny. I'm a professor of infectious disease at Durham University, and amongst other things, I lead a very large international project which is about drugs and drug targets for neglected diseases, particularly Chagas disease and Leishmaniasis. So I'm currently actually in São Paulo, Brazil, as part of that initiative, talking to people at USP, the University of São Paulo here.
Now, when we say neglected diseases, are these just diseases that don't get the mainstream? Like we hear about a Will Smith or a Chris Rock, but we don't hear about the other people that are working their way up, and they might be just as important in a sense.
Well, it's a World Health Organization, WHO designation, although there are other lists, I have to say. And it's currently about 20 largely infectious diseases, but it does include snake bites. So it's not just infectious diseases. And essentially, these are conditions that are prevalent but ignored by the West, by pharmaceutical companies historically, but they have a great deal of burden. So there's more than 1 billion people affected, and the economic and health costs are massive. So we're talking about what we would term the global south. So the developing world, such as Brazil, where I am now, which has a burden of several of these neglected tropical diseases, what we can term NTD, neglected tropical disease.
I'm guessing Lyme disease wouldn't count as one of those tropical diseases.
No, it does not.
Okay.
It does not. So that has a tension.
Yeah, because I'm always looking at, like, I have a couple friends who recently have like Lyme's disease and other diseases of this sort that are like, they're not really super known, but people have heard the name before. And I start wondering, like, there's not really, I mean, even with diagnosing it, it's very, very hard to tell. You could have it for a very long time, but it just kind of makes me question more of like, why don't we have a medicine for this yet? Why don't we have this yet? And I mean, I guess that's where people are working on it and trying to figure it out, because it is a complex situation. It's kind of like cancer, for instance. We know some causes of it, but some people who might never smoke, besides that being like the basic kind of thing that everyone talks about, smoking giving you cancer, you don't know. Some people could just randomly get it, and we don't know what really causes it in a sense.
Well, I mean, cancer, you can never call cancer a neglected disease as a whole, but of course it's a panoply of different diseases, different conditions caused by different things, some of which you mentioned smoking, we know, others we don't know, others that are hereditary, we get them from our parents. Infectious disease is even more diverse because, we've got viruses. We all know about coronavirus, of course. We have bacteria, such as Lyme disease, Borrelia, and we have fungi. Thrush, for example, is a great example of a very common fungal infection, which can cause great discomfort. There are lethal ones as well. We have protozoa, that's Leishmaniasis, Leishmania, Toxoplasma, which I know is an interest to you, Robbie.
Yeah.
And we have bigger things. They're all microbes, so microscopic organisms. We can't see them. We need a microscope of various different powers to see them. Then we have large things. We have things like tapeworm, which can be several meters long, infect the gut of humans and animals, and various other worm species. So it goes from the single cell or the virus to large organisms. I mean, these are all infectious diseases. And all of those are covered, individuals of those are covered in the list of neglected tropical diseases from the WHO, which I cannot possibly be an expert in everything. It's a very diverse list. I mean,
Yeah.
much like cancer, it's diverse. And, if you work on cancer, you tend to focus on one or a group of cancers as a clinician or a researcher, not all of them.
Well, if I could ask for a particular one, I would hate to use the term like one that you're fascinated with or one that you prefer. But if you could take me through maybe a disease that you typically like to focus on, or one maybe that just interests you the most. Because I look at, like, you mentioned tapeworm, you mentioned a few of them. Tapeworm's like one that the public probably knows about. You eat something that might not be cooked properly or something like that, you might get a tapeworm or something like that. I always hear people say that when they're ravenously hungry. They're like, I might have a tapeworm. You always hear that kind of get tossed around the table. But then we have like toxoplasmosis. And I start wondering, I watched a video of somebody taking a slice of a hot dog and then putting it under a microscope, and then he examined in on it. You see these little like these little bacteria things that we can't see with our naked eyes. And I go, is that just a dirty hot dog? But he was doing it to everything. He was doing it to just the smallest stuff, which made me had a bigger respect for our bodies. But also at the same time, it made me more aware that there could be that one that just slips through or our body can't handle it. Next thing you know, you're suffering from one of these diseases. So the fact that people aren't really more infected, I would say, like, you're not running to every single person who is infected. That's amazing. That's just a good resilience on a lot of people's bodies, for instance. But if you could take me through maybe a disease that you particularly find interesting or fascinating.
Well, I mean, the first thing to point out, of course, is our bodies are full of microbes. Our food is full of microbes. The environment is full of microbes. Of course, these are largely harmless to us. I mean, the common statistic or fact that's brought out is that there are more cells of microbes in our body than there are our own cells. So we live in harmony. So we are made of microbes as well as our own cells. We exist in symbiosis. But pathogens are a relatively small subset of microbes. Now, there's those that are really proper pathogens that we will get infected by one way or another, and we will get sick. And there's ones that normally live quite happily with us. But if we are ill, immune suppressed, maybe just under stress, which immune suppresses us, we will get sick because those pathogens or opportunistic pathogens will overgrow and make us ill. Now, kind of an example of this is Toxoplasma, which is not the most primary focus of my research, but it is an interesting pathogen because it's not a neglected tropical disease, although the US regard it as a neglected parasitic disease because of its impact on food hygiene, the kind of thing you were mentioning. And it does have an impact on farming, food hygiene, health, infant mortality across the world.
Wait, so when it comes to like the classifications for diseases, if America doesn't call that a neglected disease, we call that a neglected disease, not a tropical one. Are the distinctions like, what are they basing that off of? Are they basing like, because when I hear the word tropical disease, I think you have to travel to go get that to a tropical region or some type of climate of that sort. But if we have like neglected diseases, I mean, for me, that I guess maybe because the general public doesn't get to see that disease, it's not very, very common. It's kind of a rarity, is why they might classify it that way. But it's something that can invade your home. I mean, it's like having tapeworm, it's like having ringworm, it's like having a staph infection. It's like these things that a lot of people really don't worry about because it's not super common unless maybe you're doing a sport but for some people it is very common. If you have cats and you're having a kid, for instance, toxoplasmosis lives in cat poop, or it's from what I've heard, it lives there. And that's an issue because it can affect like development of a child if they're in the womb, and maybe even younger stages of their infancy, for instance. And these are all things where I'm like, these should be like educated, at least for more people to know about, just because more people are aware. Because I guarantee if you mention to the general public what toxoplasmosis is, they're like, yeah, it's like that's like toxic waste, right? It's like kind of, I mean, but this is something a little bit different.
Yeah. So I mean, there's neglected tropical diseases. That's the list of 20. So they're largely in the tropical and subtropical areas. Although we shouldn't forget, they also can be in, say, the US and Europe as well. Particularly areas which are less economically developed in those regions. I mean, they are diseases of poverty. Toxoplasma is literally everywhere. Estimates vary, but approximately 50% of the world population has Toxoplasma because you
Wait.
never get rid of it.
Okay, so wait. Once do you recognize when you have it, or is it like undiagnosed symptoms?
Now, largely, you don't know when you've got it. It's largely completely asymptomatic, causes no disease. The typical course of infection, probably the cat litter is one source. It's possibly not the major source. It's probably more in food that you're likely to get it. So societies that eat more rare meat. So in a European perspective, the prevalence in France is much higher than the prevalence in the UK, for example, because of the tendency to eat raw meat
Oh wait,
or
so
rare meat.
okay, you said rare. I was thinking like caviar or something like that. Maybe I took that a
No,
little
no,
bit
no. This
different
is this
direction.
is you know this is mammal meat.
I was like, yeah, so the rich are gonna get it, not me, because I'm eating like cans of tuna. But so that's so where do they know what it originates from? Like, is it just a certain like something that our I guess our inner biome can't digest properly, or maybe has a bad reaction with, or is it some type of like? Because if we said you might get it from largely from cat poop or some type of cat feces, I start thinking, is it people not washing their hands properly? Is it the maybe the spoiling of the meat? Something happens. Are we able to figure out what that is?
Well, I think let's go back a bit, and I mentioned bacteria, fungi, which probably people are generally familiar with. Protozoa might be a rather alien term. It might even sound a bit alien, but protozoa are a huge group of fairly sophisticated single-celled organisms. They are more similar to human cells than bacterial cells. So their processes are quite alike to ours in terms of how they divide, how they make things, how they take things up. So Toxoplasma falls into that group, and it's actually related to the malaria parasite Plasmodium, as well as a few other human pathogens. So you can see that these generally the group of them have a wide impact, a very wide impact. Now, Toxoplasma has evidently been with us as humans through a long period of our evolution and history. The general process is that the cat is what we call the definitive host. So these are eukaryotic cells like our cells. So they actually have a sexual cycle. So they do exchange genetic material. This is what bacteria don't do, at least not in the same way. So they have sex basically. So they have boys and girls actually at one point. Yeah. So this happens in the cat gut. So the cat is what we call the definitive host. And then when the cat poops, it poops out new parasites, which they're in a form called oocysts that persist in the environment for weeks or years. Now, an interest of mine and many is the effect on sheep farming, because there's a massive economic impact on sheep farming because the cat in a simple situation, it can be more complicated. The cat poop is of a farm cat is on the grass, the sheep eat the grass, they get infected with Toxoplasma. But if that sheep is a ewe and that ewe is pregnant, that Toxoplasma can cross into the fetus and either cause abortion or malformation. So obviously that's if you go to a sheep farm, you will see aborted lambs in the spring. Just a typical European sheep farm, pretty wild, outdoors, and eventually you will see aborted lambs.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of sheep farms around here, but I could see where that could be an issue. Does that also affect like for some people that I mean, is sheep something that people eat, lamb or something like that? Can that be something that can affect food, and then that's how it gets into a bigger host? Because I always look at the parasite. There used to be an old video game you could play where you start at like this low stage and you slowly evolve by infecting bigger and bigger things until you work your way up to the food chain. I mean, that's kind of how a parasite cycle is. And necessarily it doesn't want to start off with the giant host. It kind of starts off from the bottom, and it's something that you should, I mean, more research should probably be put into just researching every possible little thing out there, only on a concept of it can eventually, after maybe some time, work its way up to attacking a bigger host, and then it becomes a problem that you don't have any information on.
I wouldn't say it as the size of the host. I mean, the fact that cat is relatively smaller than a sheep and is not really the issue here. I would say you got to think about it in terms of the life cycle, and you should think about that in all infectious diseases, and maybe protozoa are the most interesting in many ways. Although there's worms that have incredibly curious cycles in the human body and outside the human body as well. But let's stick with Toxoplasma for now. So yes, you're correct. So we eat lamb and sheep from time to time, and around the world people eat mutton, sheep meat very commonly. I've recently had mutton in Pakistan. That's a common staple. So did I get Toxoplasma? No, it was well cooked. So if you cook it well, you won't get infected. But I might be infected already. I have been when I was working as a student with Toxoplasma. That was during the HIV and AIDS crisis, and getting Toxoplasma and HIV at the same time at that point was lethal. So everybody was screened for Toxoplasma if you were handling it in a laboratory. But that's another story, and we can get back to that. But so the cycle really, it gets into meat, it forms cysts. I mean, everyone knows what a cyst is, but these are, in terms of Toxoplasma, they're called bradyzoites. That's literally slow growing in Greek. And they're walled off from the immune system of the host. So they just sit there. So you or I, or any of the audience, could have these cysts in our body exactly like a sheep or a lamb if we've come into contact with the parasite. That's how our body controls it. We don't get rid of it. It just sits there and waits.
Wait, so I'm curious. When did they realize that there is this toxoplasmosis out there? Because I'm wondering, is if a lot of people can go through life, like we might even have it, but we don't know that we have it unless maybe we get screened or take a specific test for it. Is it like our bodies are just learning how to evolve through all the generations, for instance, to be able to handle it better? Was there like a mass amount of like toxoplasmosis in the beginning when we first recognized it and realized that a lot of people were getting sick and dying from it? Because I mean, nobody wants to know that they've been infected with a parasite, but I mean, there's people that get tapeworm, there's people that get ringworm, there's people that get a lot of stuff, and they're able to still live on their life. I'm just curious if our body has became this point after, you get used to something. It's like adapting to it. If you have something inside your body for so long, your body just naturally handles it. And I would think if you're passing that on, if it's infected inside of you, you're passing that on to a younger generation, and they don't have any huge problems. Maybe their body's able to adapt, and I mean, in a sense, not really make a cure for it, but a way to where they're not hindering severe brain growth or some other issues that might hinder a person's life and cause them to die early.
Yeah, I mean, that's $1 million question and a very good one, Robbie.
I'm trying to understand this. This is complicated.
It's always questioned, it's out of the blank, as you say.
Yeah.
But it's $1 million question because we don't know, of course, exactly when humans became in contact with Toxoplasma, for example. We know from evolutionary studies, which are mathematical studies, that these parasites evolved well before humans. So they were around before. But presumably we came in contact with them very early in our own evolution. When I do not know, and nobody really knows. But then we co-evolve with the parasite. So we might have got sick at the time of first contact. We may have not, but you co-evolve and you just tolerate them. Worms are an interesting, and I'll give an example in worms. Worms are very different. As I said, they're large organisms, can be huge, living in our our gut, which is a very long, several meters long organ. So the worms can be several meters long. But certain types of worm, nematode worms, they're different to tapeworms. They're round worms. They literally look like the worms you find in your garden if you dig over the soil, but they can be, a foot long, very unpleasant. Now, these live in our gut, and our gut has an immune response to deal with these. And everyone's aware of allergy, yeah? I mean, hay fever, other allergies. Hay fever is a classic. And what worms do is they suppress what's an antibody response called IgE in the gut, so they can survive. Otherwise, they'd just be digested by our gut immune system. So they have evolved with us to suppress a part of our immune system so they can live in the gut. Now, it wouldn't be right for me to say that those worms have no health effect, because in a resource poor country where kids, and still there's about a third of kids don't get enough to eat in certain areas, that's sub-Saharan Africa, these worms can have an impact on the ability of the child to actually absorb nutrients, because the worm is effectively taking a lot of the food that the kid is getting.
Yeah.
But that's another issue. That's an example of how the parasite has adapted and evolved to live with us. And there is quite a lot of research on thinking how we can use parasites directly, worms directly, to help with allergy, or more potently, what factor in the worm leads to the suppression of this immune system. If you can suppress IgE, that antibody, you could basically stop someone getting hay fever, or certainly help a lot.
With because I remember hearing from Yeomi Park, who's a North Korean defector. She talked about how a lot of people in North Korea were going through these states, a period of starvation and looking for food, and kids would be eating trash. Like, they'd be eating anything they could possibly find on the street. And there's a huge host of parasite issues that were going on from digging in the trash and getting food out of there, and digesting that. But then they had a spike in deaths, but then it kind of fell off, where there was like a lot of people, it seemed like they were getting used to it in a sense. I would hate to use those words, but kind of that's what it was. And I start wondering, if you can't kill the parasite, if you can't get rid of it, you mentioned something about like being able to use it to a benefit in a sense. You could have this thing attack other issues that people might be dealing with. I mean, do you expect like the pharmacy or pharmaceuticals, and I give them like pharma corporations, I give them a big kind of leeway when it comes to trying to diagnose a problem, be able to give it a fix, like with a pill or something like that. You need pills. I choose not to take them, but people, you need pills on some things like gastroparesis or something like that. So if you're able to, instead of like, I know some parasites, I think a parasite's main goal, and I might be going off on a tangent, but it's not really to kill the host, because he kind of needs the host. It needs another way, or it needs to find another host. That's how they survive, is through that. But there are some parasites with like some insects, for instance, there's a certain parasite out there that actually infects their host and causes their host to go crazy and basically kill itself. And then it moves on to the next host. I don't know what exact that parasite is exactly, but there are those rare exceptions, the one that want to kill their host, but most of the time they just want to survive with their host and live off their host. Now, if that has severe effects, like I think the tapeworm's just looking for food, for instance. But if it eats too much, and then you're in a low poverty country where you can't get access to food as easily as you can in another country, that person dies, then it's bad for both parties. But if you're talking about being able to manipulate this thing, instead of eating actual human food, you could have it eat maybe some bad bacteria or something like that. Now you're looking at parasite manipulation, where you could use it to your benefit and actually might help out in some aspects of human health. Now, that might be a really sci-fi long jump, but it's just where my head's going right now, because I'm like, yo, we can turn these things into, how like you see the parasites, or those little things that have a parasitic relationship on like manta rays. They're not really bothering the manta ray, but they're cleaning it off. I mean, if we can find a way to do that with maybe more common, and not really infectious diseases, but more common parasites that people might experience, if we can use it to our benefit, you would have a whole answer to something maybe the pharma industry really can't.
Well, Robbie, get back to evolution and what we call our microbiome. That's the complexity of bacteria we have on our skin, in our guts, in most of our body. And this is already happening. We have organisms called amoebae, which live quite happily normally in our gut. They do eat bacteria, do live there, but they live in balance. The whole thing is a balance. So if we unbalance it, because say a course of antibiotics that's not a very broad spectrum, like penicillin, that kills a lot of bacteria. So anybody that's had penicillin, many people will feel, they'll have diarrhea afterwards. And that's because the microbiome, our gut, has been unbalanced, because you've killed a lot of the, I don't want to sound like an advert for yogurt, but good bacteria. And after that, the advice, the sort of holistic advice, is to have some live yogurt, which will help replace that bacteria. Yeah. So it is a balance. And we've had as humans, modern humans, 1 million years of evolution. As organisms and mammals, we've had, hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And all that time, microbes have been living with us. We can adapt further, of course. Can we manipulate? Well, I suppose technically, it is. I wouldn't want to. It's all, as you said, sci-fi, but it's possible. But I think more likely is to learn from our microbiome, from the organisms we have living happily within us, and learn how to protect and even manipulate that to overcome certain diseases and certain conditions. Because that is becoming really clear to be associated not just with our digestion and our protection from infectious disease, but in all sorts of human conditions and physiological health states. I mean, it's not an area I'm looking at. It's complicated, but it impacts. And there's a lot of people looking at this now to rather understand, including the pharmaceutical companies. Of course, they're very interested. There's product in this.
Well, how do you feel about the pharmaceutical industries? Like, because I always look at, like, the one thing I really never appreciated, which I understand in some cases you have to do, but we've had this method of like how to handle this type of stuff for a very long time. Whether it was a disease or whether it was something severe that might be life threatening, was always torch the field. I mean, I hate to use that phrase, but it is kind of like this, like we just need to go to DEFCON 5 and, take this and eliminate everything. And sometimes you eliminate, like we were saying, the good bacteria, or you eliminate some good stuff. I'm just curious if we've, in the past, I mean, from 20 years, 30 years, whatever, if we shifted from that type of thinking to a more sustainable one where it's maybe not, we don't have to get rid of everything, but is that just the safest bet? I would think if something's contaminated, it's probably better to get rid of it. Like, how many people have a water that has a hair in it and they don't want to drink the rest of that water? They don't want to take the hair out, but there are some people that do like that, take the hair out and then drink the rest. It's not infected, but contamination is a huge issue. I mean, not even talking about just with the pandemic or anything, but contamination, that is like that's something where you can't see a lot of this stuff unless it's under a microscope. And if you're asking people to make the general public to make a basis or a decision on something, they're only going to be able to see it with their eyes. Not everyone's going to have a pocket microscope to take out and examine to see if it's fully contaminated and stuff like that. It's a safe bet usually not to touch it. Good example, AIDS pandemic. In the beginning of that, everyone thought like you talk to someone with AIDS, you're going to get AIDS. That's not, we know that's not the case now. But I mean, even now, like there's people that are living with it. And like that was never even the thought when it was first arriving or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry, I work closely with the pharmaceutical industry for neglected disease. And probably most people listening will not understand or believe that pharmaceutical companies are involved in neglected tropical disease studies, but they are through a charitable wing. So the progress with HIV and AIDS, which was rapid, I mean, that, like coronavirus, that received funding, it received interest, and now it's controlled, it's not eliminated. We have to remember that HIV is a person with HIV lives with HIV and lives with a daily diet of drugs to control it. So we don't really know the downstream impact of those drugs or the presence of the virus, HIV, within the person. But in a developed country, AIDS is almost a thing of the past. You don't go from HIV positive to AIDS because the treatment available. So that's where we are with that. But getting back to the other point, I mean, there's the we live in the West in a very sterile environment. We wash everything, which is good. Now let me a point of that is the biggest thing you can do for human health is running drinking water and flushing toilets. That is the thing. I mean, there's parts of the world you can get a cold Coke, but you can't get water on tap. I mean, that's crazy, really. I mean, and alongside that, sewage systems, flushing toilets, the ability to get rid of your waste. I mean, that is the biggest thing. I mean, forget about drugs. That's an engineering solution. That's getting water to people, and it's getting waste away from people.
It's I mean, it's a good aspect that we, like some more developed countries, consider a lot of these neglected diseases, but I also think that brings in a sense of comfortability where you just move the goalpost of what you would consider a neglected disease. Like when I was a kid, you could drink out of the hose water, and now it's like, don't do that, you're going to get sick and you're going to die. And it's like, is that just because that we don't really have giant issues like we had before when it comes to these types of diseases? Like that's a good question though. Like if you really examine like the aspect of like, I think our bodies start to adapt to a more of like a luxury or a delicacy. It's kind of like never doing yard work after you did yard work for a couple of years and then you just don't do it for 40 years. Try going back to it. You're not going to be that fresh, that involved into it. You're going to be new. It's going to feel like terrible work. You're probably going to last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the consequence of living in this relatively sterile environment is that we become less familiar with the organisms around us, the potential pathogens, which wouldn't be pathogens necessarily if we became in regular contact with them and we became familiar. We developed immunity. Our microbiome was developed to control them. So that is an area of study across the world. This clean theory where we live in a clean environment, so we're less familiar with challenge, because every time we meet a microbe, we are challenged. Our body is challenged to respond, and that is also associated with the very high levels of allergy, which have increased since the 70s. Very rapidly. We all know someone who's got asthma or hay fever, and the numbers are increasing. There is a connection between that and not drinking out of hose pipes, if you like, or as an example of the obsession with not coming into contact with anything or taking a hair out of a drinking water.
Well, it leads into another question, which is, with these diseases, like not even talking about stuff that we know about, like stuff that we don't know about, with this area of comfortability or adaptability to a sterile type world, for instance, does that open up the door for maybe smaller pathogens that we probably wouldn't have had issues with start to come in? Like, would we see like newer infectious diseases, not like coronavirus, but something newer, or maybe a smaller parasite that would have more damage? I mean, we can sit there and say, well, we're not dying of tapeworm. I mean, in a sense, no, but I also think that's something that's been around for a while that our bodies have probably a lot more genetically developed to getting used to, rather than something new that just springs up out of nowhere. I mean, they were just talking about monkeypox the other day. So I was just like, what is going on now? Like I start to look at like, maybe we're getting, we definitely use medication more than we did back in the day. And it's in somewhat good parts, but also there's more of a reliance on it than ever. And I'm kind of like the person that's like, I don't really want to use a pill to get over something. I understand you need some for some, but I also think that you want to keep that body's natural ability to be able to keep that immune system high, taking care of yourself, eating a healthy diet, making sure you're getting your proper vitamins and nutrients. But even then, that's a weird territory. How many people are getting sick from chemicals that are in their food? I mean, I just went to the grocery store this morning and I picked up celery. I could smell the chemical on it. And I know people are like, you're supposed to wash it before you eat it. I'm like, yeah, but it's to think that you get it all. You could sit there and soak it in bleach for as long as you want. It's not going to clear all that chemical out. This is something that's like, it's leaving a pheromone off of it. And I start wondering, like, is that also leading to people's immune systems being shot and us getting sick quicker?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't soak your food in bleach, just as
I was going to say water, but bleach sounded cool.
If you want to put chemicals on, that's the way to do it, is to put it in bleach. Yeah, I mean, there is of course concerns of the use of chemicals in farming, and that it is a concern for decades now of the cumulative effects of chemicals in farming. I won't go down there. But in terms of our possible exposure to new pathogens, it's not, I don't think it's really our local environment so much as our tendency to travel and our tendency to live more and more in big cities. So the coronavirus situation that's a classic example. So that arose in one place. Controversial theories around that, but seems most likely it was by contact with animals in a so-called wet market, which, I've never seen a wet market, not since the 1970s, in the UK, because it's all regulated, but that's not always the case across the world. But a city I'd never heard of at the time, I'd never heard of Wuhan. I'm sure most people in the Western world had never heard of Wuhan.
Everybody knows about it now.
Everybody's now. A city of 20 million people, a huge city, never heard of. Incredible. I never thought such a large place would exist. I'd never heard of, but that's what we're all realizing, I think, the size of these places. And of course, then China's very well connected with the world now. People are flying out everywhere. So both within China, out with China. So very quickly, it came to Europe and America in particular, the rest of Asia as well. And then within those regions, it spread quickly, a highly infectious disease. And, we're 2 years and a bit down the line. And here we are, we're still living with it. It's not going to go away.
So should we have better, not even just take the example of coronavirus, but just with tropical diseases in general, if that's like something like, I think a lot of people, when they hear that, like I said in the beginning, it's kind of like a lot of people think that's why you don't travel to all of these other places, because you can get a disease or something like this, whether from drinking water or whether just something our body's not used to. People in that area are used to that, but you're not in that climate. But isn't it somewhat fascinating when you start realizing kind of the aspects of what causes these things to, like, I don't know, grow more or maybe even die off in a sense? Like coronavirus, for instance, sunlight. I mean, that was a big thing. Get your vitamin D. The sun's very, very beneficial for you. But you saw it hit in the pattern in the US, at least. It went from like the East Coast was ravaged first, and then it was the West Coast. And the climates, I mean, somewhat the same in some like beach vibes, maybe when you're talking about California or maybe the Eastern Seaboard. But if you look at like more of the country aspect of things, where people brought it to the example, it's the population. It's like, that might be true, but there are places like Texas that are like in dead heat all the time, and their numbers weren't as high as most other places. Where I start going is like, it's just interesting to see like what it makes you want to look at where the origin came from. Like if you look at the origin, say Wuhan, for instance, what's the environment there? Is it super hot? Is it like Seattle weather? Is it drainy all the time? Is it cloudy? Is it something like that? Can it survive? I mean, like when they said the sunlight was the best option, I go, you're kind of screwed if you're in the UK. It like rains like 5 days out of the week there.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I wouldn't call coronavirus a tropical disease because it's a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And Wuhan is not tropical. I'm not sure what the day-to-day weather in Wuhan is, but it's not tropical, I don't think. And really, I mean, I'm in Brazil now, but there's been 700,000 deaths in Brazil measured since the start of the pandemic, maybe more. So it's summertime all year round in most of Brazil, the areas where people live. So I don't think it's really fully understood what the seasonal weather cycles of the disease is. As far as vitamin D is important for your immune system in general. A specific effect for coronavirus is uncertain, as far as I understand. But, vitamin D is good for us. We should seek a little bit of sunshine, but not too much.
Yeah. Is it so with too many vitamins, for instance, I know, is that a cause of concern when you're dealing with like an infectious disease, or if you're dealing with maybe a tropical disease, for instance, like if someone has too much of a certain vitamin, can that actually hurt them more, even if the vitamin doesn't have any necessarily like side effects? For instance, like I have a B12 that's 3 times what I'm supposed to have, and I have no clue where I'm getting B12 from, but I have too much B12 in my body. I think a normal range is between like, they said 150 to 300, and I'm at 2000. I don't know where they're getting those numbers from, but that's what I got. So I looked up side effects. It's the first thing you do. You have a panic attack and you look up the side effects of what's too much B12. There's not any really a side effects. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm good, I guess. But to think that it's not doing something, whether it's like you wake up one day, maybe your brain's a little fatigued or something like that, and you start being a little bit more curious about, like, there's obviously too much of a good thing or too much of beneficial things overdoing in a sense. And I think a lot of people during this pandemic, and especially whenever they get sick, it's buy a whole lot of whatever they say to take, and then you take a lot of it, whether that's a vitamin or something like that. And I go, that actually might make it even worse.
Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence it makes it worse. I mean, we can tolerate very high levels of vitamins or vitamins, and normally we just secrete them out. We pee them out, essentially, the excess. And a good diet should cover all the vitamins you need in most parts of the world. I mean, there are some vitamins which include vitamin D, actually, which can lead to side effects. These are ones that accumulate in the fat of the body. So, but I think you have to work very hard. Your standard over-the-counter vitamin is not going to lead to.
When you said work very hard, I just picture someone going, "Give me 10."
Well, I mean, it's like eating polar bear livers or something like that, which I don't think most people would want to do, because they're very rich in some of these vitamins. I think that's vitamin E. So there's a few things that have a toxic level of vitamins, but not things that you're really going to come across in normal life for most individuals.
Now, you mentioned fungus earlier, which is a big aspect where my initial kind of thought goes to food, like a lot of bacteria and stuff that's on food, not just with like contamination processes, but like maybe the conditions that it's being served. Like my buddy, I remember, took a picture of his McDonald's cheeseburger, and there was like a blue spot on it, and it's mold. And you start wondering, like, how many people really take the time to examine their food in that sense? I mean, is that just the most common one, or is it more of like viruses and all this other type of stuff that people deal with?
Well, mold. I think people have been eating moldy food for a long time. Don't forget penicillins from a mold.
Yeah,
that accidentally grew in a laboratory experiment, and I don't think it's a good thing that McDonald's has mold on their cheese, but
shouldn't eat there anyway.
No, not really. But it's probably not a particularly harmful effect. It's one of those things we just tolerate. It's not a big problem, but I wouldn't seek it out.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't seek out mold either. I'm just curious to what like our most common interactions with things are, and when it comes to, like, we talked about earlier about the human's capability to adapt to stuff. I mean,
I mean, we shouldn't look at our food as sterile. We eat food. Fresh food is never sterile because it's fresh. I mean, if you want to boil it, then of course it will be sterile. But I eat blue cheese.
That's moldy cheese, man.
That's moldy cheese, yeah. And it doesn't cause me any harm.
It smells bad.
Smells bad, gives me indigestion, but I like it. So that's that's just one of those things. But Yeah, well, I don't think we shouldn't be too frightened of our environment in terms of microbes. It's a natural thing, and kind of we've cleaned away a lot of the things we used to, until relatively recently, become into contact with. I'm old enough to remember the world being quite dirty where I grew up. Now it's sterile. We've moved quite quickly.
Is it good to have this good of an understanding at least, or do you think the public should be better, I guess, educated on the general idea of what infectious diseases and other things are? Like, I know a lot of people do their own independent research, but I also think that it opened up the door for a lot of people to be more, not wouldn't say cautious, but more fearophobic, I'd say, when it comes to just everyday life. A lot of people, even now, are still not even with coronavirus, just with anything in general. There's, like I said, people that won't travel just on the fear aspect of what they might see on the television of a rare disease or something that was found. And I think that a lot of people, if they had better education on stuff as well too, besides like independent research, if they were like talking to people like you're doing, talking to me and everything like that, it just gives people an overall calm of like, yeah, but we have medicines that can handle that. And we can have this, we have a better understanding, and you're probably not going to die from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to try and educate people about risk, to be honest, and the risk to us in our local environment, the risks of travel, and the risks of getting an infectious disease in most places are pretty low if you take the advice you're given. So if you go to a malarial region, take antimalarials. Don't just go and assume you'll be okay, because for a white European to get malaria in sub-Saharan Africa can make you exceedingly ill, because we've got no natural immunity, or very little. So there are precautions you can take, and you should be educated. So, I mean, it's a simple thing. So in a few weeks' time, I will go to a remote part of Brazil, and there's no medication I will take, but I will take insect spray to make sure I don't get bitten, because I don't want to get Zika virus or anything else that's transported by insects. And I am vaccinated against yellow fever, because that is occasionally prevalent in parts of Brazil, even in cities.
What's yellow fever?
It's a virus carried by mosquitoes. It causes quite a serious disease. It breaks out in South America. It's relatively common to have outbreaks. I think it was during the building of the Panama Canal. It ended up killing a lot of the laborers who were working on the Panama Canal. I think that's the case.
So with a lot, like, because I only thing I remember with mosquitoes is that they said that you can get like Lyme's disease from a mosquito that might have bit a deer or something of that sort, something outrageous that seemed like it took 10 trips in a spin.
Yeah, well, Lyme disease is ticks. So
yeah,
typically the ticks that feed on, we get, like the US, we get it in northern UK, where there's deer and particularly deer, but other animals as well. And it's transmitted through bites of ticks. Yellow fever, like malaria, is transmitted through mosquito bites. So yellow fever, I'm just looking up I'm just trying to get my facts right here.
I'm just hoping I wasn't boring you. Thank God you told me that.
So I mean, it causes liver damage, which this is why it's called yellow fever, because it's like a liver
jaundice.
Damage, yellow, like jaundice. Yeah, it can be pretty serious with kidney damage as well. But I'm just trying to look at see if I find quickly the effect of the Panama Canal fat. But
well, does most like infectious diseases, do we become aware of it because of a certain event or some type of man-made thing? Like, for instance, like, I mean, is there like a direct correlation to a certain thing or certain infectious disease? Not saying like man created. I'm saying like a specific event. If you're mining or something like that, you spark up coal dust or something like that, you get black lung, or you do that was a man thing. You don't go out and it's like seeking for black lung basically. So I start going like, when it comes to these like Lyme disease, you obviously get that from somewhere, but where it originated from, was that an event that caused this? Like, do they know what creates most infectious diseases, or what things we would call neglected? Because I wouldn't even toss anything in a neglected category until we understand exactly how it becomes formed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's think how we become into contact with infectious diseases. So ticks and Lyme disease. So if people live in areas where there are deer, there are ticks, there is Lyme disease, they will come into contact with Lyme disease. So public consciousness of a disease then occurs when there's numbers of people who have the characteristic target sort of bite and then become quite ill. So that leads to research trying to find the causative agent. And I think a nice example of this is Legionnaire's disease, which originated in the US as a epidemic form from, I think it was in Chicago. I think it's called Legionnaire's because it was the military reunion in a hotel, and the air conditioning system and the water cooling system had the bacteria growing within it, and it ended up infecting a lot of the elderly residents. I think this was the 1970s. So, and before that, nobody had heard or thought of it as a disease. I mean, it just didn't exist. But as soon as, we have commonplace air conditioning systems, and then we have numbers of people in hotels and other environments with air conditioning systems, we get infection, and there was a great effort at the time to almost like a criminal investigation to find the causative agent. And it was over Time magazine and all sorts of publications. It was in the public consciousness. So that's when it moves from sort of esoteric infectious disease science into the public domain, is when you get an outbreak. And coronaviruses, probably nobody had heard of coronaviruses, but they've been around for millions of years, probably. But of course, we have SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus virus that's circulating around the globe now. And it's in everyone's consciousness, isn't it? They might not understand it fully, and there's no reason they should, but it comes to the consciousness. And then with massive investment, we get a selection of vaccines and some drugs as well that can help.
Does it also create like a nocebo effect or something like that? Like, so many people I know always blame something on COVID. They're like, oh, I forgot because of COVID, or I might have, like, everyone's like being a hypochondriac now, which is really interesting, which I think you just look at so many symptoms, or it's so much in our consciousness now that people are just like, whenever they get sick, whenever it's this, they kind of get like, oh, it must be this or it must be that. And then it's a weird question, but even like, one that always comes to my mind is, there's that disease that you get from eating human spinal tissue. They have a name. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like, I don't know the name of it. I forgot the name.
Yeah, well, no, this was being from the UK, I'm particularly familiar with this. So this was not human spinal tissue. This was cattle.
Okay, because I know there's mad cow disease, but there's a human version as well too.
Oh well, there is, and that's a related disease actually, and it occasionally breaks out in this is I've got to use my words carefully, ritualistic cannibalistic communities.
That's what I'm saying by a man-created event. There's psychopaths out there that are like, I'm going to eat this type of thing, and the next thing you know, they get this rare thing. But like, that's not something the general public is going to come in contact with. That's a disease I could see could be on the neglected list. You got to look for a specific target of individuals compared to other diseases that come from maybe environmental factors. But that's a rare one in itself.
Yeah, I mean, no, I wouldn't call anyone who's doing ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea as a psychopath. It's religion and it's culture.
I didn't know it was religious. I thought it was a bunch of cannibals in the woods or something like that. I didn't even know the region.
No. This is honoring the dead. This is keeping the spirits alive. So it's actually sophisticated human behavior. It's not killing people. These are people that have died.
Oh, I was picturing like some dude jumping in the woods with like a knife and slaughtering teenagers like a horror movie and eating
No,
their
no,
meat.
no. It's not quite that exciting.
Well,
But yeah,
that
yeah.
took the stigma right out of the topic for me. I was thinking that I had this whole other built up story in my head. But I mean, if it's a ritualistic stuff, I mean, yeah, I mean, I get it if a lot of people talk about religious exemptions on stuff, but I don't know. That one just, that's a lot. I mean, I guess they think of it differently. So maybe my understanding and my own personal experience, I can't put into that. But that is something that's like, someone had to do that, and then you had to learn about it, and hope to God, I guess, that a lot of people probably we wouldn't have to, like, we don't have a medication for that, do we? That's just something that's a rare
no, no.
case.
Well, I mean, again, it's that the cannibalistic is a disease called cura, as I remember. That was, a small area, small numbers of people with that cultural practice. But really, it's sort of come to light as comparison with broader diseases of the same nature, neurological diseases. You mentioned the mad cow thing, but also various diseases which are either genetic, which we see in small numbers, but in our industrialized Western areas as well as elsewhere, where we do have similar pathology to the cura in this relatively small community with ritualistic practice. And that's not an infectious disease as such. It's about our body being unable to make a protein in the correct way. So this protein accumulates in our brain and causes damage. So it's quite different. I mean, it is potentially infective, but it's really about, it's not a foreign agent. It's actually about being unable to actually deal with a protein in the correct way, and one of our own proteins.
What scares you most about an infectious disease? Like, do you worry more about like the physical ailments, or do you worry more about the mental ailments?
What, in general or specifically?
I mean, you could go specific if you want, but I was talking more generally because I mean, I mentioned earlier about having more knowledge about stuff makes you more aware. And I think the public should be more aware about some things, but also, how are you not a hypochondriac? Like, how do you study this stuff? So it's like you know every aspect of how things can be contaminated, how things can be this. It would just put more fear into my mind of what's out there.
Well, I think being informed, or as informed as possible, is helpful to reduce fear and paranoia. I probably, if you were asked me what I'm most frightened of globally, in a very practical way, is antimicrobial resistance. This is when antibiotics particularly become ineffective against bacteria. Because we are heading towards a point where if you go in for, say, gastric surgery, you have a good chance of getting very ill after the surgery, because the antibiotics are not going to be available to prevent infection. Because as soon as you open up someone's gut, however careful you are, you mix around all that microbiome material that we were talking about.
So they can't absorb the antibiotics, or the
Well,
antibiotics work.
the bacteria, the pathogens are becoming resistant to the antibiotics.
They're getting smarter.
So it's rapid evolution. The eye has become increasingly off the ball with the coronavirus pandemic, but the eye has not really been on the ball for a long time. And that is the crisis we will have to deal with quite soon, 10, 20 years, probably 10 years, more than 20. There's not been a new antibiotic class for approaching 40 years now. We are pretty much on the embers of antibiotic development.
Are we shifting towards a new form, or is it something that we just haven't really paid attention to because there's just been other problems afoot?
Well, I think, I think the coronavirus pandemic has obviously absorbed a lot of people's fear and attention in one direction. But also we've become very relaxed, I think, in the developed world, at least, about bacterial infection, because you think, just get an antibiotic.
So I was making sense earlier when I mentioned that. Okay.
Yeah, but we've become relaxed. These are not the kind of drugs that make most profit for industry, for the pharmaceutical industry. Government funding has been limited, and you need industry to help with proper drug development. So it is a potential crisis. I mean, we have poor antibiotic management in most of the world, to be honest, because you should never get an antibiotic for a viral infection, because it's not going to help. But in some parts of the world, you can get antibiotics over the shelf, over the counter, off the shelf. But that should never happen either. We should, it should be strictly regulated. So they're given to people who really need them. Otherwise, they're going to disappear. And they should be, use in agriculture should be very restricted. I think, where you are, the US has got a lot of antibiotics in agriculture.
Well, so is it just our carelessness of how we distribute it that's kind of been the fact that it hasn't really changed and it's just always worked, so we expect it to always work? I mean, is it a business influence onto medicine, which I've noticed during, like, even with the pandemic and a bunch of other stuff, there's always been like these, you're seeing a lot of stuff that seems like it's not really been that way before, or hasn't really rolled that way, where, I mean, I get it's about making money. And I know there was a stigma before the pandemic, before everybody started caring so much about pharma industries just wanting money. Big pharma was the term for it. And, like, I don't want to slander pharmaceutical companies because they do play a big part, but I also think, I mean, it's very hard to stay sane when you're making a lot of cash. And that becomes an issue because, I mean, are we more focused on caring about people as well, too? I mean, independent scientists are, but giant corporations that don't know your name or face, it becomes an issue.
Well, we as you said, we do need the pharmaceutical industry and its might, power, and ability to come up with solutions. And maybe they need encouragement sometimes. It's the model is they're private corporations or public corporations. They have shareholders or not, but they are there to make a profit. So there's more profit in a drug that someone takes for 40 years for high blood pressure than an antibiotic that someone takes for 2 weeks. That's just obvious, isn't it? So there's a lot of focus on chronic conditions, diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. Infectious diseases, they're quite a small part of the portfolio now for most pharmaceutical companies. I think if I take a UK perspective, the primary vaccine that was developed at Oxford University, it was then manufactured in collaboration with AstraZeneca, which is a UK-based pharma company. AstraZeneca closed down its vaccine research several years before, and then it was manufacturing vaccine.
Even though that's a fact, you got to be careful because YouTube won't let that be up there. So yeah, isn't that nuts? That's what I'm saying. It's like, even when you talk about vaccines, as long as, if you're saying someone can get it, you can say that. You can't say it in any other terms. Even if a business closed down and that's an actual fact that you can look up, they're like, no, don't say that.
No, I've never been I've never been off kilter with YouTube before, I don't think, but just trying to state the fact. The point really is vaccines are very important tools. We've seen that. That is why we're in there. That's why I was able to travel to Brazil with confidence. They have a great vaccination program here. The UK has a great vaccination program. So, with free movement, I can come to the US now, because of the vaccination. There's no other reason. But vaccines are exactly they are not great for profit, because the best vaccine you have once or twice and never again in your life.
That's I know saying that that's how real that is. It's just it's so complicated because I think from our personal experience, we would want like, oh, you'd want to make a treatment someone, you don't want them on a medication their whole life. But if you're looking from a business aspect, that's exactly what you want. You want someone on a medication their whole life. I know people that are like, for me, for instance, I'm suggested giving a pill for a digestive issue that I have, and I'd probably have to take that the rest of my life. It went from taking 9 different ones to now just one. And it's like if I have to take that for the rest of my life just to be able to function properly, it's an issue because I don't like taking anything. And I can see there's not a whole lot of progress being shifted towards maybe helping out with like vaccines, unless it was like the pandemic where you had maybe a specific company or so do so. But just with stuff that it takes 2 weeks, like take this malaria medication. It's like this hasn't been updated in like 20 years. Doesn't it works? It still works. It's like, but for how long? Are you paying attention to that long time span? I mean, if our bacteria are adjusting, if our bodies are adjusting, and we're maybe building up more of a tolerance to the things that are intended to help us when before they did work, I mean, should we be paying attention to that? Yeah, but that's not what like most of the general public's not going to be going and getting gut surgery. It's like, you don't know that. How many chemicals are we dumping in our food? There's a lot of people having digestive issues. I would like to be aware of all this stuff. I mean, it kind of sucks. I mean, do you see it eventually people just kind of waking up to the aspect of like more independent researchers or maybe more independent scientists who are creating their own facilities and using more of a style of personalized medicine that can help drive that push to be like, hey, we need to pay attention to the shift that you mentioned earlier with these medications that we're using might not be effective in 10, maybe even shorter than that.
Yeah, I mean, the term personalized medicine is literally that. Certainly not something I'm really a great fan of, although because I have a developing world focus in my research and my interest and direction. Personalized medicine means literally that. It is a medicine created for the individual, for their individual condition. So that's very much a commodification of disease and treatment for an individual person. So I don't want to criticize the pharmaceutical industry too much, but it's just, as I said, it's just the model of profit. It will not solve the problem of the need for vaccines. Let us not forget that coronavirus vaccines were pretty much funded by public money in terms of their research and development, and then commodified by industry. So it is, they industry did not make those vaccines. They did not create the intellectual property behind them. They might have then commodified it, but that's not the way it really worked. And antibiotics are the same, essentially. I don't think industry will, without a lot of public push, invest in antibiotic development. It'll be a minor thing for them, but we need now a significant push for that. And well, just while I'm here on my journey to Brazil, I mean, really, with looking, I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned, in leishmaniasis caused by another protozoa, Leishmania. And there are, and I've been talking about this yesterday, there are basically 5 drugs available, all of which are toxic, some of which are 100 years old, for a disease that threatens 1 billion people. And I've seen patients. I've actually gone to visit hospitals in Pakistan and seen kids with horrible lesions on their faces, which will scar them for life. I've seen people with life-threatening disease as well. But there's just 5 drugs, all of which have problems. And the diagnostics are, actually telling someone they have the disease is also problematic. So, compared with the development towards cancer therapy or therapies for diabetes or any of these things, the amount of investment in that condition is pitiful, to be honest. And I think it really is because of the the profit margin and the poverty of the people who are affected. And it is a great problem.
It's crazy how this stuff links into like social things as well too. Like I think as a lot of it's like the stigma behind stuff. Like remember back in the day when people had syphilis, they'd call them big wigs because the people would wear giant powdered wigs to cover up the lesions on the top of their head from syphilis. But everyone thought, oh no, that's a wealth class thing. And it was like the way that they switched it so people wouldn't make fun of them for having syphilis was like, hey, we wear these giant powdered wigs because we're high class, and it got taken off in that direction. I bet you'd have a lot more advocacy for this drug you're talking about, like for this disease you're talking about with 5 drugs that are all bad. If more people were, advocating behind it or stepping and talking about it who actually had the disease. But if it's something rare, people don't want to let other people know they have it. But if you notice, when you have something, it might be more common than not. People go, oh, I have that too, or I had something like that, or they'd be more willing to be open about the conversation of it. And you start finding out that more people might have an issue that you also suffer with. You don't need to hide it to yourself. And actually, it might actually help talking about it to understand it better and also get more push behind it, make it more noticeable to the public. The reason why you had so many people care about coronavirus is because it affected everybody. It wasn't just one certain subset of a population. But if you ask somebody to donate to a malaria foundation, they probably aren't going to do it unless it pops up on their screen after they pay their grocery bill, because it's not in their public view. It's not something that a lot of countries or main ones like US or UK or something like that really have to deal with unless you're traveling. You become more knowledgeable about it. Every single person I've talked to who's dealt with malaria or some type of infectious disease that's so discreet or something like that, they travel and they go to these places and they care about the people there. I'm not saying that people here don't care, but we don't know those people. It's kind of like the same examples with the pharma industry. They don't know us. They just know that they're making something and they want to find a way to make money. It's not bad. It's just really a good plan, I guess.
I mean, I think they're good examples, Robbie. And malaria is not a neglected tropical disease, although because it does.
I was talking about more of a rare
attention.
disease.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, it is less in the public consciousness in the Western world than coronavirus or HIV or diabetes or cancer, but it still affects and kills hundreds of thousands of people. It affects millions, tens of hundreds of millions. Leishmaniasis is further down the food chain of public consciousness in the West than malaria. Most people will not have heard of it.
First time I heard of it.
Yeah, well, there you go. Its impact on vast parts of the world is huge and growing. I mean, I think a good example is the Syrian war, where people moved into refugee camps in, say, Lebanon or Jordan, and they have massive outbreaks of leishmaniasis with these lesions on children and adults because the people have moved into areas either they from areas with the parasite and they sort of took it with them, but often more likely they moved into areas where nobody really lived, hence a refugee camp. And there's lots of the sand flies which transmit this protozoan pathogen, and it only takes one person who's infected for the sandfly then to pick it up and take it around other people, and it cascades very quickly.
The only reason I know about this is because I don't know if you follow the White Coast Waste Project, but not even like 5-6 months ago, you heard about Fauci, and then there was a certain beagles that was mentioned in articles about sand flies infesting the eyes of these beagles. That's what they were doing. They were testing on finding ways to do that. And people were like, they're killing the dogs. And it was like, yeah, that was very shocking to the public. I don't think everybody is aware of that. But that's the thing, is like what we have in our purview is only important if it affects us, or if it affects something that everyone can relate to, which is like, we know people have a certain infectious disease or something, but it might be so down the food chain, like you're mentioning, that it's not in the public's view and they probably don't know about it. But everyone has a dog. So if you see a dog get infected with it, you care about it. Everyone has a child. You see a child get infected. A lot of people stand up and they feel that. My whole thing in life is just to make sure that we have an unrealistic expectation of where medicine is. And I think it causes people to get mad at it sometimes when it doesn't work. And I say, hey, You got to understand it's not a perfect science. They're trying, but there's a lot of other things that go into play in this. So you have to be patient on a lot of stuff. But it's a whole chain link of one side's doing one thing and one side's doing another thing. You got to work together in some aspects. And my fear is that people are going to become so comfortable with where they think technology is that they can let their bodies go to shit, and they'll be like, well, they'll figure that out, and they have science that can do that. It's like, no, we don't. If you get diabetes, that is something you will live with. That is not something it's going to just go away. They're not going to have a cure for it. And people think, oh, they'll probably figure out some medication to give me or something like that. It's like, it's you understand what you're saying? Like that's a big thing. And I think a lot of the public falls in that, especially in the States. That's a big thing. A lot of people just, do what they possibly can, burn the candle at both ends. And they wonder why, when they get sick, why is there no cure? Why do I still have this? It's like, yeah, AIDS went away. Is it though? Because it's still here, but people are managing their symptoms. And you wouldn't know that unless you knew that person was taking pills every single day. But a lot of people don't hear about it anymore. And that'll slowly slip out of our purview.
Yeah, I think it is slipping away from the consciousness, as you say. But really, my position, what I really want to see is a more egalitarian view of health treatment and the treatment of humankind, rather than our very sort of narcissistic Western approach that you were mentioning of thinking we have a right to medical treatment and it'll solve everything for us, and head in the sand kind of approach to everything, which is that's a very generic statement. But I really want to see the power of art, global technology, and the pharmaceutical industries directed at global problems in a way similar to how we approach the coronavirus as a global society. That had problems, but there was a large and rapid mobilization of technology.
Yeah.
To get to the point we are now.
Yeah, I think. Well, when you
I would.
We're gonna keep.
No, I was just going to say, just finish off, Robbie. I was going to say the problems again with the vaccine distribution to the developing world still exist, and they're poor, very poorly. It's very poorly managed, and I think the Western world should really be ashamed of how little support it gave to Asia and Africa in particular.
It's this mentality that's not part of your tribe, so we should only worry about our own tribe. And I get it. Like, I mean, I understand you want to take care of your family before you start taking care of your neighborhood type deal, but they never adjust though when they start getting their family taken care of. You know what I mean? There's never that adjustment to fixing the neighborhood. There's more of a mindset of like, well, now we're good and everything's back. It's like, well, no, it's not, because there are still other people suffering from some stuff. And what I really liked, why I think this conversation kind of went all over the board, probably in more ways than you were expecting, but it's because you have more of a open type of discussion type deal like I like, which is kind of what my show is. I mean, it's talking about issues. It doesn't necessarily have to focus about one thing, but I mean, you being open to the public and being honest and being just, talking about things from a rational point of view and from your own perspective. A lot of people just prefer to talk with the lab coat on or with that type of deal. And I don't think that's how you're going to be able to touch a lot of people anymore. You're not going to be able to really connect with a lot of people like you just did with me today. I mean, we didn't talk about anything like super, super serious or super political, but we got into a discussion about a lot of things and we kind of just shared that conversation, which I think that's what the public really honestly wants to hear. If we saw more of that happening now, I bet you would see a lot more things get done faster. There's just a large disconnect between people looking at people like that dude's a lab coat and that person's a citizen. It's like, you can't look at it like that. Like, we're still human beings at a base point. When you lose that human factor, you basically end up where we're in now. What you just mentioned was you get disconnected from the rest of the world. There's still people over there too.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think part of my job, so one of the reasons I agreed to do this is really advocacy for neglected diseases in neglected populations. so people understand we live in a global community. And really, I don't want to talk about coronavirus too much, but that really emphasizes how global we are. The next pandemic is only a step away.
Yeah,
because we are that connected. I mean, I've traveled around the world this week just to get here. I'll be traveling further. I'm one of millions of people doing the same journeys. So you can see how easily things can travel around, diseases, but attitudes as well. We are becoming more multicultural, multi-diverse as time goes by, because more of us are getting contact with each other. I think that remains very important. So we do actually understand the world a little bit better in a global sense.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I really appreciate you giving me your time and talking on the show. I want to get you back on, but I got to get like another guest in here too. I know someone great that we could do a chat with, but it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Seriously, is there a place where people can find you? Do you have anything you want to promote? Any foundations, anything like that? Any links? Twitter? You got a Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, so it's
about to follow you
at FillingV, FILLINGV. So that is the Twitter feed for the large-scale project I lead, which is the GCRF MRC, that's Medical Research Council funded global network for neglected tropical diseases, and also Durham University's Center for Global Infectious Disease.
Spell it one more time.
Which bit?
The
Twitter?
Yeah, the Twitter.
Filling at F. I'm going to double check this, Robbie, because I'm tech stupid.
I'm going to link it in the description, but for anybody listening that's trying to spell it.
Got it. At capital FILLING capital V.
Filling V. GCRF NTD network.
That's me. Well, that I manage that with
do you have a personal one I can follow too?
The administrators. I haven't got a personal one.
Any pictures of your cat with toxic plasmas?
Yeah. So that is the sole and the only one. But I'm easily found on the Durham University's website. I'm there. Nice comments only, please. No abuse.
I have friendly fans, I hope.
and very happy to hear from people.
Well, I'll link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.